Welcome to Devlog 1 of a game called A Part of You. If you haven't seen the previous devlog, check that out for an explanation of the game. It's been a while since my last video, but don't let that fool you. I haven't given up on this project so soon. Now that finals are over, I finally have some time to put together a video. But what have I been working on? Two things mainly: random dungeon generation and random item generation. Let's cover the dungeon generation first. As a roguelike, this game will rely on a grid system. The player will occupy a tile and can move to adjacent tiles. Enemies, item effects, and attacks will also adhere to this grid system. So first things first, we need to define the play field. In other words, which tiles of the grid are part of the dungeon floor. Usually, roguelites will have a system that generates some kind of network of rooms and hallways. I've done something similar, but not quite the same. I decided to use Perlin noise to determine which tiles should be part of the dungeon floor. Perlin noise is a special kind of randomness that's usually used in terrain generation. By using it to generate dungeon floors, the floors will have a more organic look to them. I spent a lot of time optimizing and making sure that all parts of the dungeon floor are accessible. After some testing, I'm pretty happy with how fast it is. Here are a few examples of floor layouts. There's still a lot to do, but I decided to move on to random item generation. I took a look at some existing roguelites to get an idea of the core components of an item. Here's what I was able to come up with. Every item has an effect, a use condition that determines when the effect activates, and a requirement that has to be met for the effect to activate. For example, when the player loses health, if the player has less than 50 gold, give the player 10 gold. Now I know what you're thinking, dear viewer, but wait, can't an item have multiple effects? And can't an item have multiple requirements for each of those effects? And can't an item have multiple use conditions for each of those effects and requirements? Yes, dear viewer, you are correct. But you see, adding all of those things would add a lot of complexity, and it would take a significant amount of time and effort. Which is exactly why I did it. I mean, come on, did you see the previous devlog? Clearly, I did not want to make things easy on myself. So here's what I did. I took the effect, use condition, and requirement from the item and put them into a thing I call a conditional effect. I then made it so that items can have any number of these conditional effects. I also made it so that a conditional effect can have any number of effects, any number of use conditions, and I replaced the requirement with something I call a requirement group. Why didn't you just do the same thing with the requirements that you did with the effects and use conditions, I hear you asking. Well, allow me to explain, dear viewer. A requirement group is something that contains any number of requirement groups. A requirement group is something that contains any number of requirement groups. A requirement group is... okay, enough of that. To understand why this recursive structure is important, let's take a look at an example. If the player's health is less than 50, or if the player's energy is between 25 and 50. Here, there are three distinct requirements. The player's health is less than 50, the player's energy is greater than 25, and the player's energy is less than 50. If we just throw all of these requirements into a list, we wouldn't have enough information to properly evaluate the intended requirement. How do we know which individual requirements need to be met in order for the whole thing to be considered true? But if we group requirements together and allow groups to contain other groups, we can retain the structure of the intended requirement. Alright, so without going into too much more technical detail, I continued to break down each component even further until I ended up with this. This is my roadmap for randomly generating items. See, I told you I wasn't planning to make things easy on myself. I also added a couple of other things that will likely change in the future. One thing I added is a quality system. The quality of a component is just a number that determines how useful that component is. For example, an item that deals 10 damage to one enemy would have a lower quality than an item that deals 10 damage to all enemies. So I can give components a quality, and the game will calculate the overall quality of the resulting item. This system is likely to change in favor of a more organized quality system. For example, instead of having a single number describe a component's quality, There will be one number to describe a component's offensive usefulness, and one number to describe a component's defensive usefulness. I also added a description system. Similarly to the quality system, I can give components a description, and the game will put together a few sentences to describe the resulting item. This system is likely to be removed entirely. If I ever plan to add languages other than English, then this system wouldn't work as is. I could rework it to try to include as many languages as possible, but I actually have an idea I think will work better, but that's for another devlog. My plan for now is to make creatures that can wander around the newly generated dungeon floors, and possibly implement a structure spawning system. But that's gonna be it for this devlog. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I'll get to see you in the next one. But until then, peace.